Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Ranking Member McGovern for his questions.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with the chairman of the committee. I think that the American people are the best judge. And I'd encourage my Republican friends, I'd encourage the chairman to go home and do a town hall meeting. You get an earful right now, because people are like shocked that they thought that Trump was going to focus in on lowering the cost of living for people, lowering the cost of eggs, and lowering the cost of fuel, and lowering the cost of rents and everything else. And everything's going in the wrong direction. And with the promise of tariffs, things are even getting worse. Yeah, so go home and do a town hall, listen to people, and they see through this. We could talk all we want about how, oh, don't worry about Medicaid, and don't worry about Medicare, and don't worry about anything. Everything's going to be beautiful. And then you look at the numbers that are contained in this budget, and it just defies reality. People are tired of the BS. They really are. And don't lecture us about how, you know, the tax cuts were somehow a great boon for average families. I got an analysis here saying that rather than use their windfalls from the 2017 tax laws, corporate tax cut to increase wages for rank-and-file workers, corporations have boosted stock buybacks, which exceed $1 trillion in 2025, according to a recent Goldman Sachs analysis. I mean, people at the top, big corporations, use this to enrich themselves. So again, I'm shocked at this budget. I'm shocked at the cruel cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP assistance, to assistance for working families that are outlined in this budget resolution. I think all, again, to protect the ultra-rich from paying their fair share. Middle class and working families deserve more money in their pockets, but the rest of what's outlined in this budget, it's a billionaire giveaway. It's a giveaway to the well-off and the well-connected. This is not what our constituents want. In fact, this Republican budget plan is a betrayal of the middle class that funnels taxpayer dollars into giveaways for the ultra-rich. This is inhumane, and Americans are watching exactly what you're doing. And on top of all of this, I think it's hypocritical. So less than a year ago, the Budget Committee met and reported out a 2025 budget. That budget never came to the House floor, but every Republican on the Budget Committee supported it. Now, Chairman Arrington, you're back with a new 2025 budget that also has been reported out by your committee, and I think it's revealing to compare the two. For instance, last year you brought forward a budget that would result in the United States being $40 trillion in debt in 2034. Now, less than a year later, you're before us with a budget that would instead result in the United States being $56 trillion in debt in 2034. What in the world has happened in the past months that has made you think it's appropriate for our nation's debt to increase by 40% over your prior budget?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member and dear friend, and you are a friend. But it's, I think, important to note that my Democrat colleagues never did a budget resolution in the committee, not once. We at least laid out a framework for a balanced budget, which was the first one that you mentioned, and now we've worked in regular order to put forward a balanced budget resolution that will not add to the deficit.
Well,
And so you ask what the difference is. The difference is we have a conference that worked collectively to make sure that we put the policies in place to grow this economy and start to bend the curve on mandatory spending, which is 75% of the budget and 90% of the increase in the budget, and certainly the preponderance of what's driving the debt. The last time anybody's even touched mandatory spending in a significant way was in 1997 at $400 billion. It was a bipartisan effort to reduce the deficit. We are long overdue for this.
But the numbers I'm giving you, Mr. Chairman, are from your very own budget. On page 6, line 16 of your fiscal year 2025 budget resolution from the 118th Congress, just over $40 trillion in debt in 2034. That's your budget. And then on page 6, line 9 of the resolution we're discussing today, $55.5 trillion. It's right here. I mean, Ranking Member Boyle, are you able to confirm that?
If you want to direct me to the page, I believe that you are correct, but if you want to direct me to the page, I can.
Page 6, line 9 of the resolution we're debating right now.
Fiscal year 2034, $55,566,372,000,000. So yes, that is correct. More than $55 trillion.
Yeah, and then, and this was in the, last year's budget was at $40 trillion. So, I mean, clearly, something has changed. I mean, the double talk on the budget, I think, is absolutely incredible. Republicans claim this is a responsible budget that will help, not hurt the debt, but their own resolution plans on $16 trillion more in terms of dollars going to add to the debt, $16 trillion more than they planned on just last year. And there's another difference between last year's Republican budget and this year's one that I find particularly interesting. Last year's budget had a whole section about limiting budget gimmicks that, quote, obscure the federal budget's true condition, end quote. This year, that section is mysteriously missing. Ranking Member Boyle, is that because Republicans are now using such budget gimmicks to try to justify voting for an explosion to our national debt?
The short answer is yes. I would refer people to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, certainly not a progressive organization and one that has been an equal opportunity, one that has actually criticized both sides in recent years when it comes to deficit and debt. They have pointed out repeatedly just what an absolute gimmick this is. It assumes growth projections that are entirely unrealistic, and no nonpartisan group comes anywhere close to coming up with in order for them to mask the fact that this explodes our deficit and debt.
Yeah, and I think what's clear to me is that the Republicans on this committee, on the Rules Committee, who voted for that budget last year, Mr. Roy, Mr. Norman, and Mrs. Fishbach, clearly shouldn't vote for this rule if they actually care about the deficit and the debt. You know, I had to point out that absurd contradiction, but now let's talk about what I think is the real scandal here, which is the constant tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires that Republicans keep on passing. Last time Trump was in charge, Republicans cut taxes on giant corporations, lowering the corporate tax rate by 14% and giving huge handouts to Amazon and Meta and every other billionaire corporation out there. Ranking Member Boyle, why aren't Republicans talking today about why aren't Republicans talking today about extending those corporate cuts?
Yeah. So the original 2017 TCJA brought the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That is obviously a 14-point reduction, but on a percentage basis, it's actually a 40% cut in the corporate tax rate. They decided to make that permanent. They didn't make, and I've heard a lot of conversation from the other side already about the tax cuts that were included for lower income folks and working class folks, tax cuts that were a pittance compared to what the richest 1% of Americans got. Nonetheless, they didn't make them permanent. They didn't make any of the tax cuts permanent. The only thing they made permanent were the corporate tax cuts, the 40% reduction in the corporate tax rate. Final point on this, because there was an argument, President Obama and a number of Democrats, such as myself, were arguing that we should reduce the top rate at 35% to something lower and broaden the base by closing loopholes. There was no company that ever came into my office that had the nerve to ask for a 40% reduction. They were looking for something in the high 20s, somewhere around the average of other nations. So the reduction from 35% to 21% was absolutely massive, and this was made permanent, which again I think reflects the priorities.
So just to be clear, I want to get this straight. Republicans made their tax cuts for giant corporations permanent, but let the tax cuts for working families expire.
That's
Is that
correct.
right? Okay. Now, if that doesn't show where President Trump and the Republicans' priorities are, I'm not sure what does. But I just want to get a sense of what the thinking on this is from the chairman of the committee, of the Budget Committee, Mr. Arrington. Mr. Chairman, and this is really a yes or no question. I'm not looking for necessarily a long answer, but is it your position that we cannot raise taxes on people making over $1 million a year by a single cent? Is that your position?
My position is that we should lower taxes for every American. They pay too much in
So
taxes.
millionaires and billionaires should get their taxes reduced?
Well, our position at the time was, and of other points to make on the corporate tax rate, is that we differed from our Democrat colleagues who were okay keeping our business tax rates higher than communist China. We thought that was not wise nor competitive for American companies. So we simply wanted to give some competitiveness. We're still outside the top 25%, by the way, in terms of rates, but you could help us lock in comparable tax treatment to like 26 million small businesses with the 20% deduction.
Well,
in
as you know,
199.
there are corporations that pay zero in taxes because of all the loopholes that are in the tax law, right? And that's just a fact. And the idea that we have a budget before us that is calling for huge cuts that we know are going to negatively impact programs like Medicaid. And by the way, those cuts are not going to result in savings. You cut Medicaid at the level you want to cut Medicaid by, let me tell you what's going to happen. People aren't going to go get primary care. Or if they get sick, they're not going to go to the doctors. And you know what's going to happen? They'll end up in emergency rooms. And we're going to pay dearly for that. That's the most expensive kind of health care. But we're cutting those things. And we know as we're gathered here today that because of all the loopholes, we have some corporations paying zero. But rather than go after that, we're going after poor people. We're going after food benefits and SNAP. We're going after farmers, who are struggling right now. We're going after small businesses. We're going after people who struggle. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Do you think it is okay that Tesla pays nothing in taxes as the company pays Elon Musk tens of billions of dollars? Do you see anything wrong with that?
I think it's wrong to let illegal immigrants benefit from our social services, and that's what's happening on Medicaid. And in fact,
Well, first of all, that's not the question. I mean, and the reality is, we could have a conversation on on what all the value that immigrants bring to our communities and our businesses, by the way.
Sure.
And our businesses. But the bottom line is, I'm asking about the company that Elon owns, Tesla, and I'm asking your opinion. You have to design a budget with revenue that we have coming in, and I want to know if you think it's okay that Tesla pays nothing in taxes.
Corporations pay a tax rate. They pay, shareholders pay capital gains taxes. We've got taxes from cradle to grave. We've got taxes up and down the government chain from local, state, and federal taxes. I'm simply submitting to you that lower tax rates for all
but you're not,
benefit the country.
so in other words, you're not going to answer my question, but I ask you unanimous consent to submit into the record an article from Investors Business Daily entitled, "Nearly 10% of S&P 500 companies paid no tax, including Tesla."
Where's the article from?
Investors Business Daily.
Without objection?
And do you think it is fair that right now in this country, it's possible that a billionaire can pay a lower effective tax rate than a firefighter or a nurse?
I think it's unfair for 1% and unhealthy for the top 1% to pay almost half the expenses of our collective federal government. I think it's unfair for the top 10% to pay effectively 75% of the freight. I think we ought to have an ownership society where everybody feels a part
So you
of
think
our
the
country.
answer, I take it the answer is yes on that. Do you think it's right that hedge fund managers and CEOs get all kinds of special tax breaks, but teachers, police officers, and truck drivers don't?
I'm for closing special interest deductions, credits, loopholes of all kinds, and flattening the tax regime, just like repealing the green energy tax breaks.
So you would basically join Democrats in demanding that all these special loopholes get closed so that these billionaires and these big corporations that are not paying any taxes right now
I think
will
we
be
should,
forced to pay taxes.
I think we should work together to clean up the tax code, and I would include the green energy tax giveaways that were unilaterally supported 100% by every Democrat, And those were corporations, 90%
I
of it.
just wish you were in charge of the Budget Committee if you were agreeing with me, because, you know, this was an opportunity to kind of set out some goals here and some direction. If tax cuts for billionaires and corporations are job creators, like your side claims, why did they use the last round of Trump's tax cuts for stock buybacks instead of raising wages?
The working middle-class American family gained $5,000 of their hard-earned money, by the way,
Right.
to pay
But-
for a
but according to-
21% inflation
But
tax caused by the
according
reckless
to a
spending of
recent
your
Goldman
party.
Sachs analysis, rather than use their windfalls from the 2017 tax laws corporate tax cut to increase wages for rank-and-file workers, corporations have boosted stock buybacks, which will exceed $1 trillion in 2025.
I would just note, you're closing in on 16 minutes.
I appreciate it, but I've been on this committee when some of my colleagues on the other side have used 45 minutes or 60 minutes to go ask questions. So I'll try to wrap this up.
appreciate your discretion.
Yeah, but this is important.
I appreciate
And this is
the
important, and we're not going to have any opportunity to debate this in any detail on the House floor because of the rules that my Republican friends are going to impose. Trump bragged about avoiding taxes and using loopholes. Do you support a system where billionaires like Trump get to pay little or nothing? Why aren't you doing anything to fix that now that you're in charge?
I think we should broaden the base. I think we should clean up the tax code. I think there are lots of ways to do that, by the way, where there are constituencies, so to speak, that benefit or that are more connected to one party or the other. We ought to work together to do that.
So to be fair, because I asked this question of Mr. Boyle, why did Republicans choose to let Trump's tax cut for corporations remain permanent, but let middle-class individual tax cuts expire?
Well, the corporate tax rates were the most pro-growth of all. So when we talk about the $5,000 in wage increases, when we talk about poverty rates, when we talk about repatriation, the biggest driver of that was making sure we weren't the highest taxed business enterprise in the developed world and higher than
I
communist
just told you
China.
how they use that money for stock buybacks. And by the way, you know, just for the record, you know, I'll be honest with you, billionaires need us. Billionaires need people, not the other way around. But, you know, these companies took that tax break and they enriched their shareholders. Will you support a reconciliation bill outlined by this budget resolution that has any cuts in Medicaid or Medicare?
I will support a budget resolution or a reconciliation bill that does not allow hard-earned tax dollars to flow to people who are in this country illegally.
Yeah,
And I will
but
also support a bill.
You're not answering my
Yeah.
question. Will you support a reconciliation bill that cuts SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program?
Yeah, Mr. McGovern, this exercise is not about cutting benefits from, in spite of
is.
your
It
comments.
very much is.
It's
It
not.
is.
It's actually expecting that the tax dollar that was intended to go to the beneficiary goes to the beneficiary, not an illegal immigrant. And not somebody that doesn't
I don't even know
qualify
what
for
you're
the
talking
job.
about. Well, I mean, people.
May I give you an example?
People who, on the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, thought that these businesses that got the most generous benefits were going to invest in increasing people's wages and investing in infrastructure and more jobs. They did not do that. But, you know, do you know what the, I'm assuming the answer to this is yes, but have you ever talked to a family who's on SNAP?
Absolutely.
And do you know what the average SNAP benefit per person per meal is?
You've mentioned it before, but you could tell me. I don't have it in front of me.
It's right now it's about $2.07 per person per meal. Right now, our back of envelope calculation on what benefits would be cut, and it would be if they cut the 2021 benefit update, would take that from $2.07 per person per meal to about $1.60 per person per meal. Do you know how many people, you know, are on SNAP in your district, Mr. Arrington?
A lot less after we passed the Tax Cuts
I'm
and
gonna tell
Jobs
you.
Act. A
Well,
lot
I'll tell you,
less.
36,529.
The goal
And with
should be
and
to
with-
keep people off the
Right,
welfare
well,
rolls
you know
and
what,
trapped
those
in
tax
poverty.
cuts didn't.
It-
And with
ours did.
respect,
6 million people were, I don't mean to cut you off.
well, the fact of the matter is, you know, Ms. Arrington, you know, 36,529 is quite a few people. in your district.
I have a
and
lot
that
more
number-
taxpayers
right.
in my
But with
district,
respect to
and I
my
have a lot
Republican
more
colleague,
people-
excuse me,
Yes,
I'm,
Go ahead.
with respect to my Republican colleagues, and to you, Mr. Arrington.
Yeah, please.
You're doing these cuts, and you don't even know what you're cutting. And I know how many recipients are in my district.
Yeah, I totally, Mr.
48,389, almost 50,000.
That's
And
a
they're
false
all
statement.
And they're all scared shitless
Yeah.
at what these cuts
they
mean for their
should be
families,
with your-
for their kids, and I mean.
I would be too with
yeah.
the fear-mongering that you
Well,
have perpetuated
you have a
along with your colleagues.
$230
And it's not
billion,
true.
you have a $230 billion cut in the ag section of this bill. And we know that, commodities, U.S. Farm commodities are not going to be targeted. Our farmers are already going to be hurt by Trump trying to eliminate USAID because $2 billion of the food that we send overseas is purchased from our local farmers. But let me finally turn back to Ranking Member Boyle. It is my understanding that Speaker Johnson made a backroom deal with certain members of the Republican Freedom Caucus to add a bill to this resolution that speeds up government deregulation. It's called the REINS Act during your markup. But what I see is just a policy statement with no force of law. Is that accurate?
So after at that point, about 12 hours into our markup, the majority offered two amendments, the first of which was the REINS Act, which would do exactly what you described. And while it might sound to some innocuous, the ramifications would be devastating. The REINS Act would block rules that ensure the safety of our food, air, water, and workplace. So this is something that, if enacted, would have real ramifications for most Americans.
So right now, it's a policy statement with no force of law, right?
That's correct.
And if they were somehow to make this fake provision real in this resolution, based on your understanding, would the REINS Act ever actually make it through the Senate in a reconciliation bill?
Well, that's where you run into, and I'm certainly not the Senate parliamentarian, but there is part of the rather quirky rules of reconciliation is this provision that there can be nothing attached to a budget resolution in order to remain under the rules of reconciliation to retain its privilege that can have a non-incidental budgetary impact. And so, given that, I have to say it's hard to see how that would survive.
So the REINS Act is not a revenue measure, it's a regulatory measure, and therefore, that's the reason why it would not make it
Correct.
through
I
the
mean,
Senate.
not only, you might recall 4 years ago when House Democrats were attempting to use, as part of their reconciliation, a provision to increase the minimum wage, which hasn't been increased in this country in a decade and a half and is still $7.25 an hour. Even though that would seem to have a fairly obvious budgetary impact to me, the Senate parliamentarian ruled that the impact was incidental and therefore struck it out. Here you have this policy statement with no budgetary impact, so it seems pretty obvious that it wouldn't fly with the parliamentarian, and it's pretty clear it would be taken out.
So I'll just say, to people like Mr. Norman, if you're going to vote for this bill because of the REINS Act, you might want to have a conversation with the Senate parliamentarian. So, for folks at home, and let me close here, and frankly, for some in this room, let me share exactly what's going on here. Speaker Johnson is trying to do a magic trick with this budget scam, and he wants to make sure that none of us look too closely, because he's telling the moderate Republicans one thing and turning around and telling the House Freedom Caucus another. And they can't both be true. So we'll see on the floor who the suckers are, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would remind members and witnesses that we're not supposed to talk over one another when we can. I know we get excited and things are being said. Further, would remind folks that in Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Practice and Procedure, while we have gone away from that, we weren't supposed to talk about what the Senate might or might not do because we're two independent bodies.